San Pedro, California, spring 1950. The morning mist rolled in off the Pacific, soft and gray, mixing with the salty tang of sea spray and the sharp scent of diesel from tugboats pulling larger ships away from the piers, while gulls wheeled overhead, their cries echoing against steel hulls and wooden pilings. A hospital ship, converted from a decommissioned transport vessel, lay berthed at Terminal Island, its deck alive with activity, doctors, nurses and medical staff inspecting pallets of supplies, stretchers covered with white sheets, crates stamped medic and aid, while dock workers loaded last-minute boxes and dockhands strung heavy power cables. The ship, flying the stars and stripes, was preparing to depart on a humanitarian mission up the west coast to provide medical relief to communities still recovering from wartime shortages and injuries. Among the crowd on the pier, an older man made his way forward, slow but purposeful, leaning slightly on a walking stick, carrying a battered leather satchel clasped closed by two brass buckles, and pinned to his jacket lapel a faded WU2 Veterans Medal. Its ribbon worn, its metal dulled by years, but still recognizable to those who knew. His name was William Bill Carter, United States Army veteran, now in his late 60s, posture bent by time and memory, but eyes clear and steady as he approached the gangway, offering access to the ship. He carried more than hope. Inside that satchel were letters, photographs, and personal effects of soldiers who never came home. Items he had protected through years of silence, determined that their stories would not be lost. Just as he placed his hand on the gangway's rope railing, two naval port security guards stepped forward, uniforms crisp, caps casting shadows over eyes that asked no questions. "Sir," said the younger guard, voice firm, "you can't board. You're not on the manifest. Only approved medical staff and personnel are permitted." The older guard echoed, adding, "We need clearance. Do you have authorization papers?" Bill hesitated, glancing at the clipboard held by one guard. The list of names so complete, so sterile, as though every person who mattered but lacked paperwork was invisible. He clutched his satchel more tightly, searching his memory for a document, a slip of paper, anything, but none existed to justify what he carried in his heart. A low murmur arose among bystanders. Some dockworkers paused mid-step. A nurse, adjusting her cap, looked over from the loading ramp. The sun, breaking through cloud cover, glinted off the ship's metal, casting stark lines of light and shadow across Bill's face. He found himself being judged not for his deeds, but for his absence from a list, as though heroism and truth depended on bureaucratic boxes checked or unchecked. Then from the crowd came a cry. A woman's voice, clear and trembling, rose above the noise of banging crates and distant foghorns. "Wait! Don't stop him! He saved my life in 1944. Heads turned. The guards stiffened. The nurse, in white uniform dusted with traces of mission pack supplies, hurried forward. Her name was Eleanor Ellie Hayes, now a senior nurse with years of service, but once a young Army nurse stationed overseas. She stood in front of Bill with determination burning in her eyes, voice strong despite the tremor. "William Carter carried me out from under collapsing masonry in Naples. I would be dead if not for him." Silence slammed down, sudden and complete. The bustle of the pier came to a stillness. Even the gulls' cries faded, as though they too waited. The guards looked at Bill. Bill looked at Ellie. Ellie looked at the ship. For a moment, history seemed to fold in upon itself, war and peace colliding as though they were shadows that refused to be separated. Then one of the guards, clearing his throat, said softly, "Authorization or not, he belongs on that ship." And the way opened. If this story has moved you the same way it moved me while writing it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep telling true stories that inspire, remember, and heal. And now, get ready, because what follows will change everything. Despite the nurse's cry cutting through the noise of the pier, the guards remained firm, their posture rigid, their eyes shadowed beneath caps that betrayed more duty than compassion. William Bill Carter stood at the base of the gangway, the salty wind tugging at his coat, the leather satchel hanging from his shoulder, its brass buckles catching shards of sunlight, yet none of that made him seem important to the uniformed men who were sworn to protect order but seemed blinded by paperwork. One guard, middle-aged, with a face creased by years of bark-like responsibility, cleared his throat and said in a flat tone, "Sir, company policy mandates that only those listed on the manifest may board. No exceptions." His voice held no malice, only the cold precision of regulation. The other guard, younger, hands clasped behind his back, nodded, refusing to meet Bill's eyes, as though acknowledging that to look too closely would reveal an inconvenient truth. Bill raised his chin, nodded respectfully, and spoke, his voice steady though betraying a lifetime of invisible scars. "I carry letters, photos, final words of men who never made it home. I'm not here for passage. I want only to hand over what they left behind, so their family might know they lived and were not forgotten." The guards exchanged glances with each other, then with their clipboard, each name checked, each box ticked. But Bill's name was not there. His credentials were not recognized. His war stories, if admitted, did not qualify as valid papers in an era where forms are more trusted than flesh memory. The crowd around them hushed. Dock workers pausing their tasks, stevedores leaning on crates, nurses folding their arms, everyone straining to hear. Bill, with one rigid hand resting on his satchel, felt the weight of uncounted years upon his shoulders, that quiet ache of being dismissed by those who did not know what he carried. He watched the ship's railings, polished metal bright, ropes coiled neat, and stretchers waiting in silent rows, all ready, but the man at the gate denied. Then, with a voice that shook but did not break, the nurse stepped forward. Eleanor Ellie Hayes, uniform clean, though her shoes bore the dust of crates, her eyes bright, cheeks flushed. She called out, "Stop! Let him board! You don't know. He saved me in 1944. He pulled me from rubble in Naples after the bombing, carried me when everyone else fled." Her words tumbled over the dock, over the men with clipboards, over the machinery, until they hovered in the air, impossible to ignore. The guards froze, echoes of her story hitting like waves against a seawall. People around froze. Bill's breath caught. The younger guard's jaw clenched. The older one's hand twitched near his radio as if wanting to call for orders. For a moment, time paused. The ship itself seemed to hold its breath. Ellie's voice trembled, not just with memory, but with gravity, with need for justice long denied. She stood flush against the gangway, rain of sunlight dancing on steel, and said, "I know it was 44. I know who stood there. You may have forgotten him. I did not. And here he stands, with no paper, but with proof that lives saved are more than signatures." Then, leadership of those guarding, a supervisor in a crisp uniform with a silver badge strode forward from the ship's deck. He surveyed the guard post, the nurse, the veteran. No need for loud commands. His voice carried calm authority as he said, "He belongs on board, manifest or no. We cannot turn away the living proof of what we are meant to heal." And with that, the guards, stiff and surprised, stepped aside. Bill, chest heavy, heart racing, hesitated, not because he was hesitant to go, but because he had carried years of waiting. Ellie offered her hand, guiding him up the gangway. The boards creaked under his boots as he ascended, letters safe in his satchel, past tidy crates of medical gear and stretchers waiting for patients. He passed the glint of polished brass rails, the white paint worn by salt and footsteps, the murmurs of the crew turning into whispers of admiration. He didn't smile. Smiling had felt too loud for much of his life, but inside him, something shifted. The long silence broken, his story no longer ignored. Italy, spring of 1944. The hills around Naples were jagged silhouettes against a war-torn sky, with olive trees scorched by artillery fire, dirt roads choked with mud, and the acrid smell of cordite lingering over shattered buildings. William Bill Carter was stationed there as a medic with the Army's field hospital units, his uniform stained, boots caked in grime, nights filled with the moans of the wounded and the distant rumble of shells. He did not know fear the way many thought. He knew calculation, which wounds to dress first, which stretchers to strap quickest, which lives might still be saved before dawn. One evening, just after dusk, the horizon was pink and then grey, the air strangely still, as though the hills themselves held their breath. Bill had finished his rounds, his hands bloodied, his heart heavy from the weight of lives lost. Then came a blast. A bomb dropped not far away, collapse of beams, stone and plaster raining down. Among the chaos, a cry echoed, high, raw, broken. A woman's scream, cut off by dust and fire, pleading, lost in the collapse. Bill sprinted toward the sound, his pulses pounding, splinters in the air, tongues of flame flickering in wrecked doorways, and there she was. A young army nurse, fallen among the ruins of what had been a makeshift triage tent. She was bleeding, pinned beneath broken masonry, one arm twisted, the other hand extended, reaching for help. The war was roaring all around, bombs, shouts, orders, the metallic scent of blood. But in that moment, everything else receded. The nurse's face was pale, eyes wide, her uniform torn, her lips trembling. Without hesitation, Bill dropped to his knees beside her, dug through debris, pulling beams aside, ignoring his own cuts, ignoring the fire's heat pressing at his back. He lifted her, carried her over uneven rubble, over shattered tiles, across blood-smeared ground, toward a safer patch beneath a standing wall. Every step was agony, shells whistled overhead, wood cracked, mortar fell. The nurse gasped, weak, in pain, but alive. Bill ignored fatigue, ignored the ringing in his ears, only focused on saving her, saving one life when many were lost that day. Later, in a tent lit by a single flickering lantern, when the night was at its darkest and the cries of others still drifted in, he bandaged her wounds. She was feverish, in shock. He held her hand. She whispered thanks, though part of her might have feared the pain. He listened. He spoke little. He stayed until dawn, until she slept, until the first light came filtering through fabric roofs, until her breathing was steadier, until he believed she might survive. After the battle moved on, after the shelling ceased and Allied lines shifted, Bill lost her. Through the smoke, through the march north, he never asked for recognition. He had no name, no address. All he took from her was the memory of her eyes, of her tremble, of the way she pressed her hand to his shirt, murmuring that someone had stayed behind. In the years after the war, Bill often woke in the night, that scream echoing still in his mind. Help, help me. It was not a dream. It was memory that refused to be silent. He wondered if she survived, if she told her family, if she remembered him. He carried with him fragments, a torn patch of her uniform, a photograph someone had given him, letters of comrades killed, names scratched on scraps of paper. These things he kept in his battered satchel, against loss, against forgetting. So when, in 1950, he heard that a hospital ship would be loading not just medicine and doctors, but personal effects of the fallen, when he learned there was a chance that archives would receive letters and photos of those who never came home, he felt a pull in his chest, something ancient like duty, because saving her was only half the journey. The other half was bearing witness. The morning sun had climbed higher over the industrial skyline of San Pedro, glinting off steel cranes and tugboat stacks, as William Bill Carter stepped through the gangway of the hospital ship, not as a patient, not as a visitor, but as someone carrying a burden of memory that had finally found an outlet. The ship, named SS Pacific Hope, had been repurposed after the war, its giant cargo holds converted into wards, operating theaters built where once only freight had been stored, and its decks reworked to hold rows of bunks and stretchers instead of crates of supplies. It was part of a new initiative to aid communities along the U.S. West Coast that were still struggling from loss, disease, and displacement. Veterans, families of soldiers, labor camps, migrant workers, survivors of Pacific Island campaigns, people whose wounds, physical or emotional, had not been fully tended. Bill walked past nurses in crisp white uniforms carrying trays of instruments, past doctors checking charts and volunteers folding bandages at long tables. He felt in his chest the weight of the battered satchel under his arm, inside of which lay letters addressed to widows, postcards from distant battlefields, photographs of faces frozen in smiles they never got to live beyond. He had heard that the Pacific Hope's mission today included not only treatment for current injuries and sickness, but also gathering of stories and items from war, archives to preserve what was nearly lost, to ensure that names, not numbers, were remembered by future generations. Standing in a small administrative room just off the deck, Bill and Eleanor "Ellie" Hayes sat opposite each other across a folding metal table. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and sea air, with maps tacked to the walls and lantern light spilling in through portholes. Ellie, her nurse's cap set firmly, looked at him, eyes sharp with both compassion and resolve. "I'm not here to be treated," Bill said, voice hushed but firm. "I'm here because I promised once, before so many went silent, that I would deliver what remained of them. Their last words, their faces, their memories. I heard that this ship is helping collect relics, letters, keepsakes of those lost in the war. If there's any chance, I want these to live beyond my lifetime." Ellie nodded, her hand moving involuntarily to touch the edge of the satchel. "You did more than carry letters," she replied. "You carried a history, a promise to the families who never got to say goodbye. You saved me, Bill, but you've saved so many, not by saving them from bullets, but saving them from being forgotten." With that, Bill opened the satchel. Envelopes, yellowed and frayed, carried titles such as "To my mother, if I don't come back, for my child to see." Some photographs were curled at the edges, showing men he had known in foxholes, others showing stretches of coast, olive trees, destroyed buildings, memories, every single one heavy with loss. He spoke of each. The soldier who died in Anzio, the boy who wrote from Sicily and begged his father's forgiveness, the nurse who carried a wounded man all night by moonlight. Ellie listened, tears unbidden in her eyes. She helped him sort the documents, labeling folders, making copies. She promised him that these papers would be archived, that a small museum section on the Pacific Hope would dedicate space to them, and that families who could be traced would be contacted. She arranged that each name would be read aloud at a memorial service planned for the end of the mission when the ship docked in San Francisco. As they walked out onto the deck, the sound of the ocean breeze and the creaking of rigging accompanied them. Sailors strapped down lifeboats, workers loaded supplies, and nurses escorted patients to wards. Bill paused, looking out at the horizon, the tugboats pulling the ship's lines, the gulls circling overhead. He realized that this mission was not just about delivering aid, but about creating a bridge between past and present, between those who had fought and those who now tended to the wounds of time. Ellie placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You came here carrying stories," she said. "Now others will carry them with you." In that moment, Bill felt something shift, a burden lifted slightly. He was no longer alone with the memories. The mission of the ship, the promise he had held for years, the weight of loss, all were turning into something that meant more than regret. They were becoming remembrance, respect, a legacy. Later that afternoon, as the hospital ship SS Pacific Hope floated gently on the tide, its decks humming with activity, an assembly of medical staff, volunteers, patients and crew gathered in the main ward deck-turned meeting hall. The sun streamed through portholes, casting bright patches on wooden benches and polished brass rails, and there was a quiet tension in the air, not of fear, but of expectancy, something unspoken and intimate that invited reflection. Men and women who had known loss, who had patched wounds visible and invisible, sat together. Nurses smoothed white aprons, doctors adjusted their sleeves, volunteers clasped hands, awaiting what might come. Ellie Hayes stepped forward to a makeshift podium. Her voice, when she spoke, was firm, yet soft, the voice of someone who had seen too much sorrow and yet believed in something better. She cleared her throat, let her eyes sweep over the crowd. "Before we depart tonight," she began, I want to share something not in our mission briefings, not in our daily rounds, but in stories. Real stories of lives that were nearly lost, voices that almost went silent. She looked directly at Bill. He stood off to the side, leather satchel now placed on a small chair, face calm, hands loosely folded. The crowd was quiet, the creaks of benches, the shuffle of uniforms, the distant slosh of water against the hull, the only other sounds. In 1944, Ellie said, her tone steady, in Naples, William Carter carried me out from rubble after the bombing. I was pinned, hallucinating, thinking I would die. Amid chaos, he found me. He dragged me through the carnage. He saved me, but I never got to say thank you. A small gasp rose. Some turned away, some nodded. Ellie held up a small wooden box with a delicate medal inside, bronze, modest, engraved with "in memory and gratitude." She lifted it high in a gesture of quiet honor. William Carter, she continued, this medal is not from any government or military decoration. It is ours, from those of us here, from those whose voices no longer carry. We honor you today, not because war asked you to, but because you refused to let memory die. She extended the medal toward him, and Bill walked forward, slow but steady. Hands trembling, he accepted it. His eyes held relief, but also humility. The kind of humility born from carrying burdens so long alone. He raised the medal in his hands, turning slightly so others could see. The crowd stood. It wasn't loud applause, but a swell of emotion. Clapping, some tears, some broad smiles. A volunteer cried out, "Thank you, sir, for remembering." Others nodded. Then Ellie spoke of the letters and photographs, how they would be preserved in the Pacific Hope's small commemorative gallery. How names would be called out each evening, how families traced would know what was once unsaid. She invited the crowd to come forward, to see the displays, to read the names, to touch the photos. Volunteers gathered around. People stepped forward quietly, reading, some pausing at a name, pressing a hand to chest. Bill stood beside Ellie, watching. A child of a migrant family leaned close, pointing at a photo of a young soldier that Bill recognized. Someone who had written him. A nurse placed a hand on Bill's shoulder. He did not speak much. He simply listened, simply felt. The warmth of recognition, the power of being seen, the healing in acknowledgement. When the ceremony ended, voices picked up again, but softly, as though in awe. Conversations fluttered about war, loss, healing. Some spoke of what they had carried silently for years. Others spoke of hope, of passing stories to younger hands. Ellie and Bill stepped outside onto the deck. The sun was slanting toward evening, golden light casting long shadows. The ship's whistle was distant, a reminder that departure was coming. Bill touched the medal at his lapel, then unpinned his satchel and looked out at the water. Ellie said softly, "You carried them all this time. Now others will carry them with you." Bill nodded. He didn't need grand speech. The recognition was enough. The shared emotion, the respect, the feeling that his mission, his years of quiet guardianship, was finally known, was enough. As the sun slipped low behind the industrial skyline of San Pedro, painting the sky in tones of gold and dusty rose, the SS Pacific Hope's engines rumbled softly against the dock. The gangways were drawn up, ropes coiled, crew secured. The deck was a picture of readiness. Stretchers stacked, medical staff moving into stations, the ship slowly pulling away from the pier, every creak and shift whispering that something far greater than supplies and personnel was underway. Something of memory, promise, reconciliation. William Bill Carter stood on the dock, not aboard. He was surrounded by the sounds of seagulls, water lapping against wooden pilings, the low chatter of dockworkers winding down their shift. His satchel, now empty of the letters and photos, lay beside him on a crate. The weight it had carried all these years had been handed over, to archives, to documentation, to people who promised remembrance. Bill's posture was straighter than when he had arrived, the lines in his face softened by something he had long hoped for, but seldom believed could come: acknowledgement. Eleanor, Ellie Hayes stood at his side, catching the last glow of sunlight on her nurse's cap. She offered her hand. Bill hesitated only a moment before clasping it. There was no need for many words. Between them lay the unspoken certainty that what had once been an invisible burden was now part of something larger, a shared mission, a story rescued from silence. The ship's horn sounded, long and low, echoing across the water. Then ropes slipped free. The Pacific Hope edged outward, its hull pushing against the current, carrying on board not only doctors, medicine, stretchers, but the legacy of lives saved and stories preserved. As it drifted, the silhouette of the deck receded slowly from the dock's edge. For moments, Bill watched the side railings, the white paint, the small figures on board become smaller until they were nothing more than shapes against the sea and sky. Ellie squeezed his hand. "You did what you came to do," she said softly. "You carried what others could not. That makes all the difference." Bill nodded, feeling the pull of both loss and relief. He understood now that his mission had never really been about being aboard a ship. It was about making sure that those who could not speak any longer would be heard, that their memories would not drift away like ash on the wind. He took a breath of salty air, letting it fill his lungs as if to clear away years of silence. Behind him, the dock was awakening to routine again. Crews folding up lines, workers hauling in crates, the distant rumble of trucks, life returning to its rhythm. Yet something had changed, for Bill, for Ellie, for all those who witnessed. The past had met the present, and through that meeting, there was kindling of hope, of understanding, of keeping faith. He bent down, picked up his empty satchel, brushed off dust, and slung it over his shoulder, not as a burden now, but as a symbol, a marker of what had been carried across years and what could now be passed forward. With Ellie beside him, he turned from the pier and walked toward home, toward a future where memories have places, names are spoken, stories preserved. The Pacific Hope became a silhouette in the distance, its wake rippling across the water. The sky deepened into twilight, a quiet blue. Bill paused, turning his face toward the ship one last time, then looked ahead, stepping forward with steadiness. Because a mission once private, born in secret, had become something shared. And in that sharing, Bill found his peace. If this story moved you, leave a comment and share it with someone who still believes in honoring the past. We publish new videos every day, real stories that move, inspire, and remind us of what truly matters.